I think the lack of communication around finances and money are a big contributing factor to divorce.
Me having to come up with that sum of money to half the equity in the house, plus half of all of this stuff, plus having to refinance it, it would have priced me right out of that house.
I am a certified financial planner and a certified divorce financial analyst. I've been in finance for over 18 years now, do holistic financial planning. So I studied and received the certified divorce financial analyst designation. And so now I really make it my mission to make sure people who are getting divorced understand the financial implications of it and help guide them through that transition.
Oh, that is so helpful, because that is one of the scariest parts of getting a divorce is all the finances involved in it. But before we start talking about that, I want to ask you, are you a forensic accountant?
I work with forensic accountants, and a lot of times there are some overlap of what we can do regarding like separate property tracing and stuff to that effect. But I do work with forensic accountants, and we refer each other clients depending upon the depth needed for the case.
Okay, so there is a little bit of overlap over what you and a forensic accountant would do, but you are two unique spheres that someone going through a divorce may need to use in order to get their finances in order and prepare to go into court or to litigate a case, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Can you give us an example?
If someone was going to a therapist and saying, hey, I'm thinking about divorce, right? I'm in this toxic relationship, but I'm staying in it, either one for the children or two for the finances. I don't know if I can afford to get divorced. And oftentimes that's a concern, right? You have two incomes or one income and one house, and you're like, we're barely making ends meet. How am I going to do this by myself?
Exactly. Yes.
So oftentimes I've referred that clients who are just kind of dipping their toes in the water, thinking about it and saying like, I don't know where to start. And I always suggest that the first phone call should be a divorce coach or a mental health professional, because you need somebody there emotionally, because it's a roller coaster and there's not a direct line from, hey, I wake up one day and like, I'm going to get divorced. And then it's just like 4 easy steps, right?
No, yeah.
I'm sure you can share your story. It's a roller coaster of emotions, of, steps forward, steps back. And so I always say the mental health aspect of a divorce should be primary. And then once that, is kind of under control, the mental health professional or the divorce coach can really help guide you as to what other players should be kind of on your divorce team. And me being a CDFA can help really just organize, no matter which way you decide. If you decide to say, hey, we're going to go to mediation, or hey, I'm going to get a lawyer, or I'm going to go to collaborative, or hey, you know what, we're going to stay together. Either way, to get financially organized, I really help gather the documents that you're going to need and explain them to you and go through the titling of the assets, know the documents that all the lawyers or the legal professionals are going to ask you and that you're going to need later. And so it's really, people always question like, well, I'm big on the divorce team, right? Like, I think you need a team of people. It's not just, okay, go hire the biggest, baddest shark in town. You need people that do different things and work collectively together. And it's actually more efficient and more cost effective to have that, because you don't want to be doing document discovery with an attorney at $650 an hour. And you don't want to be talking to the paralegal or, the legal assistant at $450 an hour venting about your bad day, when you can have a CDFA help with the documentation and a divorce coach help with kind of like the venting sessions and moving through it.
I agree. It's way less expensive to get the right people doing the right thing. So you're not paying your lawyer to be your therapist, as you say. Yes.
Yeah. And so I help people who just, sometimes they come and they're like, hey, I'm thinking about it. I don't know what this would look like. Is this possible? Would I be able to survive? Would I be able to keep the house? Am I going to have to give away half my retirement? And so I kind of just go through the math with them, help them organize the documents, and kind of give them some scenarios that could happen and prepare them for what some options are. And gone are the days of like, okay, 50-50 and that's it. The beauty of mediation collaborative is that you can really design your own divorce, and that allows you to do what's best for you and your family. So I just kind of educate and really empower people to know their numbers and, know where their documents are. And if they don't know where they are, help them find it and get financially organized. Sometimes people end up staying together. Sometimes people don't come back until 6 months later. And they're like, hey, thanks so much. I'm now ready to move forward. Now I know what statements I need. Here are the updated statements. Can we move forward? Sometimes they get brought in the middle of the process, and that could be either through a mediator or an attorney. Sometimes people are just stuck on one asset and they're like, hey, we don't know what to do about the house. House is always a big one. Both our names are on the house. We don't want to move the kids. We have a really good interest rate. We don't have a lot of assets outside the house. So we kind of play out the different scenarios, and I can kind of illustrate and say like, okay, this is what would happen if you stay in the house. This is what happens if you sell the house. This is what happens if you jointly own the house for X number of years and then sell the house. So those are the types of things that can help kind of throughout the process. If you are going straight to that litigation, very tumultuous fighting court, all of that. I have been brought in to be a financial advocate where we think that there's financial abuse or there's financial infidelity or that there's hidden assets. So it really just depends where. And then kind of my favorite part is the post-divorce transition assistance. And that's really like, all right, you're done with divorce. You're at this new chapter. And I kind of related to the fact of like, after you lose a loved one, you have the wake, you have the funeral, you have the services, the family, everyone's there kind of supporting you and then it's over and everyone goes back, right? Everyone's gone. They go back to like their normal day-to-day life. And you're just like, this is different. I'm not calling my lawyer. I don't have any meetings. I now have to pay bills by myself. Like, I now have one less person at the dinner table. I have to RSVP one. So there's all these things. There's also all these financial things that you have to do afterwards. And no one's really there for you. So I can assist in that kind of like 12 weeks after divorce to kind of really help get them on track and have an accountability partner. Educate them about, paying bills, updating their last name, checking their credit, going on Social Security, all those things that need to be done that you don't really know where to do and what to do and how to do it. So those are all the ways that I can help. It depends upon where you are. And sometimes it's start to finish, soup to nuts. I'm with somebody, and other times I just get brought in as needed.
That is really interesting. So really, when you're just kind of contemplating it, when you're in the thick of it, and then when you're done with it and need to just sort of transition into your new life, you run the gamut. You can help at any stage, one of those stages or all of those stages, basically. You touched on something about the house, and I want to tell you about briefly about my own situation, and then see what you might have recommended, and then I'll tell you what I did. So he assaulted me and was arrested. And whenever, it was all over with sort of and done that aspect and we were going to get ready for divorce, his lawyer sends a letter to me. Now, me and my kids were in the house, that he wanted half the equity in the house and he wanted me to refinance the house. Now, we had the house at 3% and the new finance rates at that point were about 8%, which would have probably priced me out of the house, to be honest. He wanted half of the equity in the house. He even went down to detailing all but everything in their pantry, like the couch, the chair, this, and he wanted half of it, which I think he was entitled to in Pennsylvania law, maybe, I don't know. And me having to come up with that sum of money to half the equity in the house, plus half of all of this stuff, plus having to refinance it, it would have priced me right out of that house. So what would be if someone is in that situation, what are some options they might have?
Did you have kids and you had the house and it was in joint name, right? And you had a mortgage?
Well, let me rephrase it. We each had 2 kids. We did house in joint name and mortgage. We each had 2 kids. His kids were no longer in the house because he had to leave it due to assaulting me. My kids were in the house. So that's the complete.
Yeah. So there's a couple things that there are options that are not just, okay, I buy you out or you buy me out, but you can structure it. And it might be different being that the kids were not jointly, joint kids per se, but one of the options that doesn't get spoken about, and it really has to do with the tax consequences and the cost basis. So sometimes we buy a house and we buy it really low, if we were lucky, a long time ago. And this is very more prominent in kind of the gray divorce area where you've held a house for, 20 years plus. And so your cost basis is really low. And with the appreciation of the housing market, there's a lot of people have equity, and it's oftentimes kind of their biggest nest egg. But it's liquid. We can't live off of it. And like you said, the interest rates play a big proponent of it. So you can jointly own the house for a set number of years. So oftentimes, and I don't know if this would necessarily work in your case, but say hey, we're going to jointly own this house for the next 6 years. Our kids will then be graduated or, out of this school district or whatever. And then we will sell the house. And in the interim, we will take advantage of that low interest rate. And whoever's living in the house will act as the tenant and pay rent or, towards the mortgage, even though you're jointly owned. And so the expenses are kind of split in a way of that you were renting, you pay for kind of your electric and your bills and that stuff. And if something were to go wrong, like a boiler, or you needed, a hot water heater or something that's a larger item, would be considered a homeowner's thing, and that you would split 50-50. So there are cases like that where we can structure it, and then you agree to sell the house at a set time. And then when you sell it, you each can have your own exclusion ratio because you'll already be divorced, but because you held it in joint name. The worst thing that people have done, and I've been on the end of this where I helped with the post-divorce transition, a client came to me and said, hey, okay, I have this house and I have this account, we had to refinance the house. Now it's double, but I wasn't leaving the house because I wanted to keep the kids in the house, and all of our memories are here and all of our stuff is here. I don't want to disrupt the kids. And so I said, okay, so we have the house, we remortgaged it. I'm like, how are we going to pay the mortgage? And she's like, oh, out of this account. And she forwent the maintenance in lieu of the house, the equity in the house. But there were still really big carrying costs in the house. And because of the interest rates, she gave up maintenance and that cash flow so that she could have more of the equity in the house. So she would remortgage less, but because it was at a higher interest rate. And so I said, okay, so are you going back to work? And she's like, no, I can't. My kids, are younger. And I said, okay, how are we going to pay? We have really high taxes. We're on Long Island. We have really high, maintenance costs. You still have this mortgage. And she's like, well, I have this account here. And it was a retirement account. And I'm like, you can't touch that until you're 59 and a half. And she kind of just looked at me like a deer in headlights. And I was like, did anybody explain this to you? And she said, no. She said, I just knew I wanted to keep the house and I did whatever it takes to keep the house. And I thought I could pay the taxes and the homeowners and all the stuff. And I would be able to, use the child support to pay. And I'm just like, so sometimes I like to get brought in as earlier so that we can avoid some of those things. But if someone would have educated her and said, hey, you can't touch this. This is not a liquid account. If you do touch it, you're taxed on it. And if you touch it before you're 59 and a half, there's a penalty for touching it. And forgoing the maintenance then gave her this nest egg. And then they had a low cost basis. So then if she went to go sell the house, she would have to pay tax on the gain above $250. So, and it's just one of those things where you just don't know, and you don't know what you don't know. And I'm a really big proponent on just really educating and teaching what you own, why you own it, what your options are, and what the tax consequences are. Because I hate when I'm brought in on that case and it's like, all right, we can do damage control, but there's not too much I can do there to help you, like. So what ended up happening in your case?
Well, I'll tell you what ended up happening, and then I honestly critique me. Tell me if I was, did the right thing, or oh my goodness, you're. So what happened was, because he did assault me and harm me, I had a civil lawsuit against him for civil damages. And so what we decided is we had an attorney write this all up. I would not pursue the civil lawsuit against him. And in turn, I would have, the house belonged to me. I would have 5 years to refinance the house.
Okay.
So that's what we basically did, was we said that, instead of, I lost all rights to that claim, that civil claim. And in turn, I got the house, I got all the equity in the house, and I got 5 years to refinance it.
So his name is still on the mortgage.
It is still on the mortgage. And I have now about 3 more years to.
Well, rates are going down, so.
I know. So, yes. And that's all I kind of felt like I could pay the house actually off in that amount of time, or down low enough that it wouldn't be that big of a deal, even if they were still at 8-9% interest, which is where they were then. And I don't think they're there now even.
No, I think that's a good alternative. I mean, I didn't know about the civil case, so that is, like good leverage to have. Yeah. And I mean, you bought yourself some time in order to do that. So taking advantage of the low interest rate to pay that down and then refinance it later. The other thing is too, and I'm not sure about like your income level and that, but a lot of times you call up and you're like, oh, is this mortgage assumable? Can I just assume the mortgage, right? And someone will say yes. And you're just like on the phone with like a customer service rep who doesn't even know what that word means or whatever. And each mortgage company has an underwriting department. And so you really have to dig deep, because at the surface, a lot of times you're like, yeah, you can just, that's fine, take that person off, not knowing that there's a whole underwriting process to make sure you have enough income and enough credit and debt to equity ratio and all of those things. And sometimes if there was no income, but now we're going to have maintenance, you have to have a couple months of that maintenance in place to show that cash flow. So the timing of things is really important. And so you can't just like stamp get divorced and then be like, okay, now I have the mortgage. And they're like, where's your income? And then you're like caught like with your pants down. Like, now I can't refinance this, but I am divorced, but I have to do this. And nobody told me this. So there's those situations where the timing is really important of all of the steps, and where a CDFA can really come in and do some hand holding in order to make sure it's done correctly for all parties. So I
did try to assume the mortgage. That was my first tactic, and it wasn't an income issue. I had the income. It wasn't enough. We had all that, but I believe because the interest rates were so different, they did not allow and I think they had a clause in there that they didn't have to allow you to assume the mortgage. And what that means to my viewer, do you mind explaining that real fast? I know it, but you probably could say it better.
Yeah. So when you have a rate, you originally apply for a mortgage, there's 2 people usually on it. There's 2 incomes. There's 2 of those persons' income, their, liabilities, and their credit scores are all impacted. So you might have a mortgage at 3-4%, and the mortgage payment might be $2,500 without taxes and homeowners. And that's something you're saying like, hey, I can do that without you. You just leave. And so you go to the mortgage company and say, hey, like, I just want to remove so-and-so's name off this. And they're like, yeah, no, sorry. And so it's not in their best interest if you think about it, because they're like, hey, we want you to refinance at a higher rate so we can get more interest and closing costs and all those other things. So it's very bank specific. And the underwriting process is very, tedious. There are actually some lenders that are specific for the divorce world that can help with that process also. I'm trying to think of the name of the acronym. It's like a certified divorce lending professional.
Oh, okay.
And so there's not many of them, but they kind of know the ins and outs. And oftentimes, if it's a complicated case, I'll bring one in to kind of help with that underwriting process. because depending upon cash flows and interest rates and different mortgages, and think about like the market too. Like sometimes there's a lot of assets, right? And right now the interest rates or the housing market is still, it's plateaued, but it's still historically high. So if you're saying like, hey, I have to buy you out now at the height of the market, that's not so pretty, you know? And then if you're saying, okay, like the flip side of that is like, okay, we're in like a crash for the stock market, or, you know, like 2008, 2007, and now you have to liquidate your portfolio in order to buy someone out of the housing market. Like that's not fun either. So it's really, you have to take everything into consideration and the whole financial picture, not just each individual asset, because they all kind of play into one another.
I didn't even really think about that, but you're right. If I would have had to buy him out, which it kind of was at the height of it, like I can't sell this house for that realistically in 3 years.
Right.
It's not gonna keep appreciating like this probably, or maybe it will, who knows? But that's a lot different. That's kind of an unfair evaluation of the house. But also, if it would have been, the 2007 housing crisis and things are tumbling 30-40% what they were worth, that's not fair either. That's not great either. So,
yeah.
So you can bring in a specialist that will help you kind of navigate those waters.
Definitely.
Have you seen people get priced out of their houses and no longer be able to be in their houses because of this?
Yeah. Especially where we are right now with, kind of supply and demand of the housing market, and the rental market is actually exorbitant too. So if you think about, okay, this is what we're paying for our mortgage, you couldn't divide that by 2 and get 2 studio apartments, let alone houses, if there's like kids and, stuff like that. Yeah, families. So there has been situations where there's been nesting, which is you own the house together. One person comes and leaves, and the kids kind of stay put. So the kids are not as, disrupted, if you will. They get to keep in their bedrooms, their kitchens, and the parents come and go. And sometimes there's 2 separate apartments. Sometimes I've had people share one apartment, which always is dicey. And I've had people just, move in with friends and family on the times when they're not there with their families. So yeah, we have to be a little creative sometimes, depending upon the financial landscape of what's going on. Rents are astronomical right now. And so unfortunately, a lot of times people stay together because of the finances, because they're like, hey, we're barely making ends meet with 2 salaries in one house. So
yes.
Like, how are we going to do this with attorney's fees and 2 houses and 2, and even just decoupling the car insurance, the cell phone, like all of those things. It's not just 50-50. It now becomes more money for each party. So that's something that not everyone takes into consideration when they're doing kind of that lifestyle analysis of what your cash flow is now versus what your cash flow will be in the future. And so I think it's really important to spend a lot of time on that, so you understand what those expenses look like, because they're never less in the future.
Exactly. They're going to be more. And that brings in a really good point. 2 things I want to say. One, that is the nesting thing. Even though we had different kids, we each had 2 kids, we were on a schedule where we were on we co-parent with our respective co-parents. And we actually thought, whenever we were thinking about this, is he gets the kid, he will get his kids in the house week A. I get my kids in the house week B. Like, we considered that, not long. That was a brief consideration, but do we do something like that so that neither sets of kids lose their home, and we just move in and out collectively, sort of, and the kids would go to their other parents, and we would go to an apartment or a friend's house or a parent's house or whatever. That seemed really, really hard, and I didn't think it was a good idea, but I understand why you might do that if you don't have other options. And the second thing I wanted to point out real fast is I did notice whenever I did start dating again and got on dating profiles, there were a lot of people, I was dating men, that were still living with their partner. And I understood why, because they could not afford to leave. Like they were not married anymore. They were divorced, but it was like, I sleep in the basement because we can't afford two houses.
Yeah, no, it's more common than not, especially just, where we are with interest rates and just finding houses, especially if there's children and we want to keep the kids in a certain school district or within their kind of neighborhoods, communities. It's really challenging. I've seen when it comes to the nesting, you have to have like an amicable relationship. There has to be a lot of trust and respect there. And yeah, it's not easy by any stretch. So there has to be a lot of consideration before you agree to something like that.
Absolutely. You would not want to do that with a co-parent that you don't get along with very well or don't trust, or it ended poorly. There really does have to be just sort of, we grew apart and we still have a lot of respect for each other, but this is just in our best interest right now. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, I know a lot of people say that their spouses like sort of hide money or aren't upfront with the money. How do you see that play out in your practice?
I think the lack of communication around finances and money are a big contributing factor to divorce in general. Oftentimes it's infidelity, and I would say number two is financial kind of infidelity. And so it stems back really to starting your relationship. Money's heavy, right? We all kind of come into our relationships with money mindsets, sometimes money trauma. And there's a real big focus on the wedding, right? Like we're going to get married and we're going to have this big party and we're going to go on a honeymoon. And we don't really kind of dig down to be like, hey, what's your credit score? Do I have to take care of my mother-in-law? Like, do you have a gambling problem? And oftentimes those really tough, awkward, heavy conversations don't get brought up until it's too late, or oftentimes kind of get pushed under the rug because they're heavy and nobody knows how to talk about it. And it goes back to like, hey, did you get an allowance? Did your parents talk to you about money? Like, did you buy your first car? Like, did anyone talk to you about credit and what that means and how it can impact your future? And so I think it's really important, but unfortunately, it is a big reason why people get divorced is the finances. And a lot of times there's a big disparity in like the financial literacy between couples. And there's a lot of regret and on kind of being the non-CFO spouse and kind of just, blindly signing the tax returns and not really knowing where the money is and where it's going and what the titling of the assets are. And all of those things really matter.
Yeah.
So in my financial planning practice, when I'm working with young couples who kind of are establishing themselves and merging their finances together, I always try to have those kind of tough conversations early on and really act as a neutral third party to kind of, get those financial habits in place and those talks. I'm a big proponent of the financial date night. And I always say like quarterly, take your spouse, your significant other, get a bottle of wine, your favorite takeout. Let's, we're planning a vacation or we're planning a home renovation. Let's sit down and talk about our budget and our cash flow. And let's talk about, where, if, there's anything coming up that we're going to have to spend money on or anything that, we think we want to change within our careers or all of those things. Or, hey, I had this credit card that kind of got out of control. I want to pay this down. Where should we pay this from? And people don't realize that their credit and their purchases affect one another when they're married. So it definitely impacts the lack of financial communication definitely impacts the relationship, as do all lack of communication. And I really am a big proponent of trying to get those healthy financial habits in early. so it doesn't end in divorce.
So people can come to you, you kind of laid out the 3 times, like when they're thinking about divorce, and then when they're thick of it, and then when they're coming out. But they could come to you at the beginning of their relationship to set the stage for a financially healthy relationship and a healthy way of looking at money and thinking about yourselves as no longer maybe 2 individual people, but one entity trying to budget money and live financially work toward goals.
Yeah, it's heavy. I think some people stay in relationships due to the finances. They don't know the numbers, right? They don't know what it could look like after the divorce. And so they just stay together because they don't have that knowledge to say, like, how do we divide this? What does this look like? What am I entitled to? And so some people stay in it, and some people stay in very unhealthy, toxic relationships, often sometimes with abuse. And we talk about abuse, being physical abuse, sexual abuse, but there's also emotional abuse and there's financial abuse. And a lot of times we come across that where you don't have access to funds, to money, to credit. And so you're kind of held captive. And that's a really stressful situation. And people, often narcissists, keep people kind of at bay there so that they don't know their options and they can't get out.
So financial abuse is whenever, like, they don't have say in the budget, they haven't put input into it, and they don't have access.
Yeah, and sometimes it happens when there's only one working employed spouse who kind of holds the purse strings and doesn't give access. So if they only have, a debit card, or they only move X number of dollars, almost like an allowance over, but they don't have access to be able to, retain an attorney, which is not cheap. And to get access to those things, to pay for therapy and self-care and all of those things. So sometimes it's just kind of holding the purse strings without, like, having access to any cash or credit. And one of the things I often, tell my clients, no matter where they are in the process, is 1, run your credit and see what's open in your name, because the opposite could be true. And if you have somebody that has an addiction problem, very oftentimes you don't always know what they have access to, and they can be very creative. There could be like an old Home Depot charge card that you guys opened when you were doing a renovation that's still open, that somehow you can get a cash advance at 29% interest rate. And so those are the things that you might not necessarily see or know about. And so running your credit is really important to kind of see what is open and what is available, depending on what side of the equation you are on, if you do have access to money or if you don't have access, or if you're trying to limit the access due to an addiction.
Have you ever seen with one of your clients where they didn't realize certain credits were open in their name until they ran this report, and they were like, oh my gosh, I didn't know I had a $10,000 Visa card or on my Visa or something like that?
Yeah, it's been worse that there's been homes that people thought were paid off, and second mortgages and home equity lines of credit were open, and through the process, large chunks of money were, taken out, and they did not know about it.
Wow. Do you see that sometimes whenever the one partner dies and then the person who is left realizes, I don't own this house?
Yeah. Unfortunately, yes. We've seen that before too, where you're just like, I didn't have no idea that this was an issue. And again, it goes back to that communication point of like, hey, where are we with our numbers? What are our assets? What are our liabilities? What are our income? What is our expenses? And sometimes people just don't know. And that's okay. And a lot of people beat themselves up. And I try to let them know, like, okay, we can't go backwards. We can only go forward. So let's learn it. And we're going to learn it together. And I'm going to teach you. And you're never going to be in this situation again.
So what do you do if someone comes to you and is like, I'm a stay-at-home wife. He controls all the money. I don't even know where our money is at. I know we have money, but I have no idea where it's at. or vice versa, I'm a stay-at-home husband and my wife takes control of everything. How do you even start to break into understanding what you own or what you have jointly?
It's not as easy as it used to be, because in the past, you can just say, hey, check the mail, take a picture with your phone, and then we'll do some digging. Now, with everything being electronic, it's really hard to find where things are. And it's hard for me to get into my own bank accounts, let alone break into like my husband's bank account. So even if things are in joint name or, joint title, you might not know where they are or have access via online profile, right? Like it might just be under your spouse's email or your spouse's has the login, even though, it's your house and your mortgage and whatnot. The tax return is always a good place. So I always say run your credit and find the most recent copy of your tax return. People usually know who their CPA is or can find a copy of their tax return because it's usually bulky and people still have like paper copies of it. And that will give us a starting point to be like, okay, once we find out where some of the things are, to kind of put the puzzle pieces together and do that like investigative work and say, all right, well, it looks like we're getting interest from this bank account. Let's go to this bank account, see what's open in our name. And sometimes it's like literally showing up because they won't do anything over the phone. You don't have logins, but to show up to a bank with like your ID and your thing and your, social security number and say like, do I have anything open here? And trying to put the puzzle pieces back together.
Wow. And then what does somebody do if, again, they're in that same situation where there is money, so they can pay for lawyers, but they don't have access to that right now. So you can't really retain the lawyer until you get that money, and you can't really get the money until the lawyer, helps you to get it. How does that play out?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. And you need you need it. Oftentimes that's why I say run your credit to see if there's any like joint credit, and not that that's the first place to go, but sometimes you're in this position where there is no cash flow. So temporarily you might need to either get a cash advance if you don't have family or friends that you can take a loan from, or and don't have an emergency fund to access, or you can put it on a credit card. Unfortunately, knowing that you're going to pay it back. And obviously divorce is not a cheap transaction by any stretch of the imagination, but knowing that you can repay it and that there will be some light at the end of the tunnel, based upon exchanging of assets later and access to funds.
Do you recommend, do you ever deal with like, if they're going to get married, the prenuptial agreements?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of prenups, because of all the divorce work I do. And I always say that it's always good when everyone's happy and healthy to make those arrangements now. And people often question like, hey, that's just planning for divorce. And I refute that and just say, no, we're hoping for the best, but planning for the worst. And that's my job as a financial planner. We're hoping that the stock market's going to do great, but we need to be often defensive and know that, at times it's going to go down and that we're going to be able to weather the storm. And so I think that it's good for both parties, especially people are getting married older now. So the divorce rates are actually going down because people are getting married a little older. But they're coming into the marriages with assets, with houses, with, large 401ks, sometimes with stock options or restricted stock options in the tech world. So there's something to be said about that. And it's easier also, I always say, like if people are very anti-prenup, to take a snapshot of where everything is right before you get married. And that will just be a starting point. Because it's really hard later on to just be like, all right, well, how much did I have in this account?
Yes.
And this is separate property, but the growth is now marital. And then we have to get that forensic accountant and do that separate property tracing, and it adds it. So it's nice if we just say like, okay, we got married on this date. This is a snapshot of all of our assets. We're going to just put it in the safe if you don't want to get a prenup, but I am pro prenup. And just say like, all right, we're going to carve these out. These assets are not to be touched like later on in life if something were to happen.
That's a great idea. Do you ever work with Postnups? Because just going back to my situation, how we got all that my situation settled was through a postnup. We were still technically married, and so that's where we laid out all the sort of groundwork for how the property was going to be distributed and what he'd get and what I would get in like what he would get in exchange was like not a civil lawsuit, but what I would get would be these sort of things. And I want to preface that it's not a criminal, it's civil. It's not criminal. You can't do that with criminal systems, but you can do it with as a settlement to a civil lawsuit. So do you do work with postnups?
I do, yeah. So I am, oftentimes, sometimes there will be a big life event, whether it's, a company going public, or private equity, an investment in a business, or an inheritance, and so what the inheritance is normally separate property, yes, generally speaking. However, the minute you put that check into a joint account, that is now a gift and it's 100% joint. So the titling of things is really important. And I stress that to my clients. But in those cases where there is either a windfall or a large transaction, whether things are rocky or not rocky, I, just say like, let's carve this out. And like, let's just put this on the side. And, people have businesses and have, assets, or they want to make an investment property. And, if the communication is good and the marriage is strong, it's, usually not an ordeal.
Yeah.
Or sometimes also if there is an addiction problem, somebody is in recovery, depending upon what the thing is, that's a way to protect yourself. If you're still working on the marriage, but protect yourself financially is through a postnup.
How does that protect yourself financially? You mean like the from the person that's going through this, or is it from like the treatment facility from taking that money?
I can't speak to the treatment facility taking that money and the payment of that, because that insurance is over my pay grade.
Okay.
But I just need, as far as like, okay, retirement assets, or hey, we have this joint account, or we have this house that you're on, but I'm nervous because of your addiction and you're in recovery. So we're going to peel that away. And now that is going to be mine, or you're not going to have access to it. Or in the case of X, Y, and Z, it's protected.
Yeah. Yeah. In hindsight, that's something I probably should have done. He was in treatment for, he wasn't at a facility, but he had recognized that he had a drinking problem, was getting help for that. And I feel like that might have been a good step to take. So if someone finds themselves in that sort of situation, it's like, okay, we're going to give this marriage another shot, but I'm scared because you've had this track history of some sort of addiction or abuse or something like that. They can come to you and you can sort of set up something like a postnup, or do you do the postnup, or you send them to a lawyer to do the postnup?
No, I work with attorneys that do that. Yeah.
And then they can set that up to sort of protect themselves. So during this trial period, if it goes bad, we hope it's going great. Like we hope for the best, but if it goes bad, you're protected.
And that's important. And it's important to, just thinking about assets in people's names. And if it's, there's all different types of addictions, yes, too, right? So gambling is a big one too. So you want to limit the access and the credit. So oftentimes things have to be moved around, while you're still married, while people are in recovery, in order to protect the family assets.
That is an excellent bit of advice and an excellent service you are offering, because so many people find themselves in that position and it's scary. And to know that you could you can financially protect yourself through that's a huge weight off of your shoulders to know that. I wish I would have known that, actually. That's fantastic.
And it's really hard because when you're in that, you feel kind of like you're drowning, right? Like you want to stop the bleeding. And it's like so hard because everyone else is kind of like life is going on around them. And you're just like, how do I stop that? And sometimes when you start to uncover how bad the situation is. So there are things to do in order to protect yourself, in those cases and really limit your risks while still supporting them in recovery.
Yeah, it's a fine line because you also don't want to, you want to support them and they're going through so much too. You don't want to throw on top of that, oh, and I wanted to, protect these financial assets and add more to their plate when they're already going through it. And then they might be thinking, well, you just want to divorce me, and you're doing this. So there's the emotional side of doing that. But then there's just the practical side of, this is the reality. This is where we're at. And we need to financially make smart decisions. So do you ever work with couples maybe that can't agree on budgeting?
Yeah. And I like when they come to me together because we can kind of do some of that mindset, like money mindset work. And I can act as that neutral third party so that they don't end in divorce. And sometimes like that light goes off when we peel back the layers of the onion and we start to talk about our families and we start to talk about, growing up and what money really means to us. And, what do we look like? What does that look like for us and how we have viewed people with money? And, does money give us power or does money give us happiness or does, our money, people with money evil and greedy? And I think it's really important moving forward on, no matter where you came from, and we all have different money mindsets and money stories and some of us money trauma. But when we're working together to establish how we want to present money to our children.
Yes.
I think that's really important. And so when people come to me and they're like, hey, I'm the investor, he's the spender, or, I'm the saver, he's the spender, or vice versa. It's really how we want to model our money. And it's hard. We live in a cashless society. So oftentimes, we're just swiping, things arrive at our door. There's that instant gratification. We can get food delivered from anywhere, rather 30 minutes or less. So it's kind of like going through our cash flow. And sometimes people have no idea even how much they're spending on certain things. I've done kind of a cash flow analysis on people and they had no idea how much they were spending just at Starbucks or, and so there's little tweaks. We can say, all right, we're spending a lot at Starbucks. I'm not going to say, no, you can't have Starbucks, right? But what if we get $100 gift card on the first of every month? And when that's done, it's done. And then you become a little bit more intentional about your spending, knowing hey, I'm not going to get that cake pop, or hey, I'm going to get a small, not a medium, or, just small little tweaks like that. Or, hey, I'm going to make coffee from home today because I'm going to go out for coffee with a friend tomorrow and treat them. So it's those small little tweaks that just make you a little bit more intentional about your spending. And those habits kind of snowball and you get in a better groove of things and you really get in sync with your numbers.
Yes, those are all very helpful tips. I love getting this sort of Starbucks card up front to say, this is my limit, and it's I'll be happy with what I have and I'll budget my gift card accordingly throughout the month. So that's fantastic. So we're winding up on the hour. If someone wanted to get in contact with you, how would they do that?
Yeah. So my website is mindfulfinancialpartners.com or mindfuldivorcepartners.com, depending upon where you are in your relationship or where you are in your financial process. I do offer complimentary consultations. So there's a calendar link on my website. You can just reach out to me and then we can go from there. And happy to meet. If there's something I can help with, I'm happy to really just educate you on where you're at. And if I can't help you, I'm happy to find another professional that might be able to help you depending upon your situation.
Awesome. And are you taking new clients?
There is a little bit of a waiting list, but I am taking new.
Okay, awesome. So I thank you so much for coming on the show. I've learned so much. I'm sure my viewers learned a ton. And I look forward to talking again.
Thanks so much for having me.